Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and today I'm going to be sharing with you all my thoughts about the Forsyte Saga by John Galsworthy. More specifically, I'm going to be talking about book 1 in this series, which is called The Man of Property. So as I've said, The Man of Property is book number 1 in the Forsyte Saga or series, and it was written in 1906 by John Galsworthy. It is a classic novel. The edition I have is put out by Oxford University Press, Oxford World Classics, and you should know that this particular book is actually a bind-up of the first 3 books in the series, The Man of Property, In Chancery, and To Let. And it doesn't say on the back, but there are also 2 sort of novellas that are inserted in between. At least that's what they appear to me. So it's not really clear whether they're part of each of the individual story or not. There are definite breaks. I read just The Man of Property. I didn't read what seemed like the little short story that came after that. So hopefully I read the entire book. It feels like I did based on where it ended. Anyway, let me continue to tell you about what I did read. The Man of Property in the edition I have was about 300 pages long. It's a work of classic fiction, which tells you pretty much nothing about the book. So let me try and give you a slightly better definition of what this classic is about. And I'm actually going to do this by using some help that I got from another book that I have, which is Genrefied Classics. This is a great work of literature, especially if you're trying to find your own niche in classics. It's kind of hard to come by because I think it might be out of print. But what it does is it breaks down a whole bunch of classics by the types of genres or topics or subtopics that are in the books. And it does go into genres if it was in a particular genre. So if it was considered satire, that kind of thing, it talks about it. John Galsworthy, I am going to talk about as a family saga because that is predominantly what it is. And if you're not familiar with the family saga, I will describe to you what a family saga is. So a family saga is basically any story that is telling the lives of an extended family. Usually over the course of the book, or often multiple books, you will hear about not just about the extended family in one time period, but you will move through the story with multiple generations. And so it's not uncommon to have family members die and be born and to continue following at least a few generations of one family. There is often frequently some sort of significant historical backdrop in which these stories are told, and the stories tend to focus on the rise and fall of the family's fortunes, their foibles, as the book that I have describes it. And interestingly, one of the other things that I learned is that it is a very popular genre and that quite frequently authors of this genre are Nobel Prize winners. So I don't know what kind of correlation exists there, but this is a book that won quite a few prizes itself, as did John Galsworthy. So with my experience specifically with this book, it took me about 5 days to read this book. I did read it almost completely via audiobook. I think I read the first couple of chapters physically. I was initially expecting to alternate between physical and audiobook reading, but I ended up listening to pretty much the entire book on audio, like I said. And I will talk about later why that ended up happening. The reason I ended up reading this book and that I'm doing a standalone book review on it is because it was my viewer pick for December 2025. And so this is the book that got the most votes by my viewers saying they wanted me to do a standalone book review on it. And so here it is for everyone to enjoy. So I'm going to do my best not to share any spoilers about the book, but I am going to discuss and give a synopsis of the book as well as go into a little bit of a plot summary, but I will not be sharing any spoilers that I am aware of. I will also put down this book, I think, and I will just put a picture of it up on the screen. Maybe as we go through this video, I will show you a couple of the different covers that I can come across. The other thing I'd like you to know before I get into reviewing the book is that in the description box below, there will be timestamps and there will also be chapters on the screen. So if you just want to click ahead to a certain point in the video, you are welcome to do that. All right, let me go ahead with my synopsis of the book. The book is about the extended family of the Forsytes. The Forsyte is the family name, and they are, in a lot of ways, an older family. They are sort of old money, kind of. And the book gets into that and kind of splices it apart about whether or not that's true, and you'll kind of have to decide for yourself in the end. But as it discusses, it is about the Forsytes, all that have been, are, will be, real and imagined. And it is set in post-Victorian England as the family and the society move into a different set of values and really into what in literature is known as the Edwardian period. A lot of the change that starts to occur in this family is kicked off by Jolly Forsyte, or young Julian Forsyte, and it is caused by, let's just say, some shocking and disappointing behavior of his that actually occurs before the story begins. And over the course of the story, we get to know a little bit more about that. But despite the fact that that is what has brought the family to this change in time, after we get to know the Forsytes as a whole, I would say the vast majority of the book actually focuses on Soames and Irene Forsyte and their marriage and their life. So to give a quick plot summary, again without spoilers, I would say the book opens with an introduction to the entire family. You get to know a pretty large cast of characters. In fact, I will pick the book back up to show you. My book actually, even thankfully, came with a family tree that extends over 2 pages. And you do basically meet in book 1 pretty much the entire top page of characters, and to some extent or another. Not all of them have points of view or anything like that, but you do get to know each of them. They do have like fairly fleshed out characteristics, and you really discover the ways and means of this family, all their quirks and quibbles, their likes, mutton, and their dislikes, like gray hats. And it's a really interesting family to a certain extent, and I think for some people. I will tell you right now that I was not one of those people. However, you do continue on with getting to know the family for quite a few chapters, I would say, and this is achieved by sort of circulating through some of the family members fairly quickly at the start, whether it's from the person whose point of view you're in going to visit other family members, or them coming over, or a change of point of view. As you move on in the story, it does eventually move into a more narrow scope where we kind of telescope or zoom in specifically on one couple and their household. And as I mentioned earlier, that is Soames and Irene. And in this household, you really get a close-up look at marriage during this time period and the tension between like the older generation and the younger generation. You get sort of the idea of why someone during this time period, specifically Soames, would feel the push to become a man of property. And as the book goes on, you get to explore exactly what that means, what that looks like, how that would be achieved, and you get to see that it's not as easy to achieve as any of the Forsytes themselves might think. And this idea of building a house in the country and becoming a man of property comes with a lot of obstacles and risk. And as the book goes on, you travel with the Forsytes, and specifically with Soames and Irene, to see if they are willing to risk it all so that Soames can become a man of property. So who are the characters in the book? I've already mentioned a couple of them, and there is a large cast of characters, as I said, and quite a few of them are really interesting and fun to explore. I think John Galsworthy did a good job of making distinctions with characters without making the reader feel overwhelmed. But I think one of the great things about the characters in this book is that they all represent different things in the book. Specifically, I'm going to share with you a quote about old Julian, who is the senior Forsyte figure who, while a tertiary character, does come up multiple times throughout the book. In his great chair, with the book rest, sat old Julian, the figurehead of his family and class and creed, with his white head and dome-like forehead, the representative of moderation and order and love of property, as lonely an old man as there was in London. And I think that description of old Julian really captures both John Galsworthy's writing as well as his characterization, as well as a lot of the themes and critiques and meanings behind what he is trying to say within this work. Other tertiary characters that you will run into are young Julian, or Jolly, who is the one that I said kind of before the book begins has sort of shocked his family into reconsidering and viewing life in a different way than they have been up to this point. There is his sister June. You have a sort of secondary character in Irene. You also have Soames, her husband, who is probably, I would say, the protagonist of the story in terms of he's the one that most of the action in this particular part of the story is happening to. And then you also have the character of Bosny, the architect, who plays a fairly significant role in the Forsyte family's lives, even though he himself is not a Forsyte. So in terms of the characters, I didn't really have a favorite character, though I did appreciate the characterization and character work that was done. I just personally didn't relate to any of the characters, and this was something that I noticed at the very beginning of the book, that not only did I not relate to them, but I was struggling to find a point of connection or even really care about this family, which is a really difficult problem to get over in a book that is about the family. And I think for me, that is where my struggles with the story began. But again, I'm going to put off talking about that to focus on the themes and topics that are addressed in the book, and then I'll come back with my review and first impressions of the book. So there are quite a few topics that are brought up in this book, including the ideas of post-Victorian London life, family and marriage values, wealth, inheritance. Home and property is a huge issue, and I think is sort of the encompassing umbrella that has to do with both the Forsytes family and this book specifically. There is a lot of discussion about love and what love means and what that looks like, as well as traditional values, meaning Victorian values versus newer or more modern values that are moving towards the values of the Edwardian period. And there is also a lot of discussion about what it is and what it means to be a Forsyte and how that may potentially encompass more than just this family. You get a lot of quotes throughout the book about what it means to be a Forsyte or what a Forsyte does or looks like, sort of a lot of truisms or Forsyteanisms, if you will. One example is it talks about how the nature of a Forsyte is to be ignorant that he is a Forsyte. And then probably one of the most revealing discussions of what a Forsyte is and their view on things comes a bit later in the book, but again, I don't think is a spoiler, but might give you a taste of what you can expect to look for in the book. And it says, a Forsyte is a man who is decidedly more than less a slave of property. He knows a good thing. He knows a safe thing, and his grip on property, it doesn't matter whether it be wives, houses, money, or reputation, is his hallmark. And I think that sums up so much of what is discovered and discussed in this book. And I really appreciate like that quote kind of bringing things together. And I think it's a quote that's helpful to even go into the book knowing that these are the things that you really need to be looking for, and the critique that is really being made about the Forsytes and people of their ilk, if you will. The other thing that I thought was really interesting about the Forsyte Saga is that while it's not a dominant theme or a topic throughout the book, it is kind of subtly a romantic family drama, as in both a romantic family drama and a romantic drama about families or involving families. Anyway, I think that's one of the major appeals of this book to a lot of people who read it. Okay, now finally, I want to get into the book and my own review about it and my thoughts on it. I think as I've sort of indicated a couple of different times, you can tell that I did struggle with parts of the book. So my first impressions of the book were that I was really sort of enjoying aspects of the writing and that I was very surprised by the humor that I was finding in it. It has a very sort of lighthearted, tongue-in-cheek tone at times, definitely falling on the side of humorous satire and humorous critique at times, and I really liked the tone of the writing overall. However, as I mentioned, I very quickly discovered that I didn't find the family very compelling. I understood who the family was, and it was very clear what they were representing, and I got what the critique was, but I wasn't interested enough in the characters themselves to want to follow them. And some of that, I have to admit, and maybe even all of it, has to do with personal preference. For whatever reason, there are certain upper class, aristocratic societies that don't particularly interest me, and those during Edwardian times, or really in the early 1900s themselves, are one of those times. For some reason, like I don't mind it in the 1800s or even in later years reading about wealthy people, but really wealthy people in the early 1900s, I just find the stories about them like really not gripping. I don't know, I feel like sometimes they're just a bunch of whiners. I don't know why particularly during that time period, but that's something that I've just noticed. So I knew that I was probably going to have a difficult time with this book because I knew it was focusing on an upper class family during that time period. And I was like, we'll see how that goes. And it went about how I expected, which was not well. Not well. I found that because I wasn't that interested in the family, that particularly the opening of the book really kind of dragged for me because the opening of the book really is introducing you to the family. And I didn't really care to get to know this family. And so that kind of made it a struggle for me right from the start. As I continued reading the book, there were some highs. Again, the humor was there, the writing was there. I really think John Galsworthy has moments in his writing that are absolutely beautiful. Like I recall there's just this one scene that's talking about June, who is the daughter of one of the Forsytes, and it talks about her experience just sitting out a window, and I thought that was absolutely beautiful. I did, however, again, like a lot of the themes in the book, especially those having to do with the changing values and the changing perspective on things. I really like stories that are about traditional values versus newer values. Like I'm thinking of Kokoro or The Wild Geese that I read earlier this year. This book has a lot of that same feel where it's not as nostalgic for the past, but there is still that tension between the old and new, and I think it was really well handled in here. I also really liked this discussion of property and even the notion of like who is a Forsyte? You know, what does this attitude and way of being encompass, or who does this attitude and way of being encompass? Lows for me in this book probably again covered the plot. I found the plotting of the story to be very slow. And not just that the book was slow paced. I feel like that the rate at events happened, there were some events that took too long, and it just kind of made the whole thing feel like it was dragging. And again, I was just not as invested in all the characters as I felt like I needed to be in order to continue to stay with this family for so long. Personally, for me, it wasn't until I was about 80% of the way through the book that I started to enjoy it, which brings me back to the point that I read this book on an audiobook, and that was because at the beginning of the book, that was the only way I found of continuing to move forward in this story. I really just like got stuck and didn't want to go on, but so many people rave about how great this book is and how much they love it and stuff that I knew I just needed to keep going because I knew that a lot of what was holding me back at the beginning of the book was just my own personal preference about the types of families that I like to read about. And I knew that if I could get over the fact that this wasn't the type of family that I'm interested in learning more about, that there might be other parts of the book that I appreciated. And there were eventually, but it was in the last 20%. And I guess that saved the end of the book for me. I don't know. At the end of the day, I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. I was very torn about it. And I think the reason that it ended up with 3.5 stars is that I could recognize why other people would like this book more than I did. I didn't feel like a lot of the things I disliked in the book were things that didn't work or were wrong or were poorly done. I feel like it was things that just butted up against personal preferences. I tend to like family stories or family sagas that are following families that are trying to make their way together through something, as opposed to families that are like sort of crumbling and falling apart because they're being destroyed from within. And not that this story was totally that. There is an aspect of where like there are things being shaken up in the family by the family members, but not necessarily for bad reasons, if that makes sense. But it still didn't work as well for me as it may work for someone else. And so because of that, I couldn't give it a 4, but I didn't feel like it deserved lower than a 3.5. I think this book would be great for anybody who likes a nice cast of characters, enjoys family stories, or as in stories about families, who can who like satire or at least tongue-in-cheek humor kind of being throughout their books, And I think this book is great, especially for people who like books that have something to say about society, because it's definitely a book that is making a lot of comments about society that I think aren't just relevant to the Edwardian society, but are relevant to society today. So that is pretty much the vast majority of what I have to say about the Forsyte Saga. After this point, I just have some things to say about continuing the series, other books by John Galsworthy, and other books that I think are similar that you might want to read if you enjoyed this book. So as far as if you want more of the Forsytes, if you read The Man of Property and you enjoy that, I can't see any reason why you wouldn't continue on with this series. There is a lot of this series to enjoy. This is book one of a series, and John Galsworthy wrote 9 books just about the Forsytes. So I think that includes the books in the series as well as novellas or short stories that he wrote about them. If you want to get all the 9 stories that are about the Forsyte, my recommendation would probably be to look up the individual titles about them. Another way to continue with more of the Forsyte is to look up the BBC television program. It is a 26-part TV series that I have every intention of reading. I did enjoy the basics of the story enough that I think in television format, I would enjoy it more because I think it would keep the pacing going at a rate that I kind of need it to go. And as with most TV series, it'll probably focus more on the drama in the story than anything else. If you want more John Galsworthy, I have a list of things to talk about regarding him. So I'll just hold my paper here while you can still kind of see the cover of the book. But John Galsworthy himself wrote 20 novels. As I mentioned, 9 of them are about the Forsytes. He also has 5 short story collections, 3 volumes of poetry, and 11 volumes of essays and sketches. I'm not sure how many of these are still available in print. This is definitely the work he is most well known for, I think because this is the work on which he won awards for. However, there are other works of his that I would definitely be interested in reading and hearing more about. When I looked up John Galsworthy on Wikipedia, it turned out that there is a commentator on his work who has kind of divided his work into sort of 4 different categories. The most obvious one being John Galsworthy's works on the Forsytes, which this person considered like a category in and of itself, which I would agree on, given that he spent 9 novels or 9 stories considering this family. He considers another section of his work to be mainly critiques on society and imperialism, and this brings in one of the novels by John Galsworthy that I am going to dig up and try and find, and that is a book called The Island of the Pharisees. So I thought I'd just share this quick quote from The Island of the Pharisees. This was published in 1904 and was considered one of John Galsworthy's critical novels. This novel apparently at the time, and probably still today for some people, offended conservatives by his attack on imperialism. And in it he wrote, "Why should we, a small portion of the world's population, assume that our standards are the proper ones for every kind of race?" Mind blown. I think for someone to say that back in 1904 is something that we don't hear enough of even today. So I'm really interested in hearing and reading that work. Hopefully it holds up in a lot of ways and isn't just a great quote in the middle of a horrible work. You never know. All right, going back to the other categories of works that he also has a collection of works that this commentator, I'll put their name on the screen, felt like fell under lyrical and wartime works. And then the third category was considered his final trilogy because he did have another trilogy of books that were interrelated. But as far as I can tell, the 9 books on the Forsyte Saga and then the trilogy he wrote on a different topic are the only series that he has. And the other 7 novels that he wrote are all standalones. So if you're looking for a standalone work of his, you could read one of those other things. I can say The Man of Property, to some extent, definitely feels like a work you could read on its own. The story towards the end is fairly resolved, though it's very clear that it would be very easy to carry on with telling more stories about this family, and clearly he did. So finally, if you enjoyed reading the Forsyte Saga or you give it a try and you really like it, there are some similar books or themes that you could look up to continue, reading more along the same lines. First and foremost, I would say you might want to continue to look for more books that are considered family sagas. Another term you could look up is multi-generational stories, because sometimes you'll look up family sagas and it ends up being more a family drama where it's a story about the drama happening within um, a nuclear family, if you will. Whereas if you look up multi-generational stories, you tend to get more the extended family story that might happen over a couple of volumes or be a really big book, that kind of thing. If you're looking for something that explores the same topics as John Galsworthy does, it was identified that his main themes in his book are in this order: beauty, love and suffering, divorce, honor, and art in the law. All of which I think you can see just in The Man of Property alone. And so you could also look for books that encompass as much as possible all of those themes. Some family sagas that I have read and would recommend that felt like this book to me would be A House for Mr. Biswas. That is a book that I feel like very much felt tone-wise and mood-wise very similar to this book, and I think also has to look at like marriage and family dynamics as well. Palace Walk by Naguib Mahfouz is a book that I recently read, and Palace Walk and the whole Cairo trilogy was actually inspired by this book. And I'm sorry if in the background you can hear my laundry machine playing its obnoxiously loud song. Okay, it finally stopped. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh, the Cairo trilogy. I didn't realize this until I happened to read A Palace Walk, the first book in the Cairo trilogy, and then immediately after that, read the Forsyte Saga, that the two books were related. But as soon as I started reading The Man of Property, I instantly picked up on the connection. And I was like, this reminds me so much of A Palace Walk. And then I read the introduction to A Palace Walk for a completely different reason and saw that, yeah, actually the author of that novel was inspired by the Forsyte Saga to write his own Egyptian version of it. So if you want a family saga that is like the Forsyte Saga but takes place in a similar time but very different culture, then read A Palace Walk or the Cairo trilogy. Another really long book that I think falls along the same lines of a family saga, but over a much shorter period of time, even though it's a way longer book, is A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth. I really love that book. If you haven't read it and you like family sagas, you need to read that book. I also feel like there are a lot of connections that could be made with the themes in this book with Anna Karenina. Buddenbrooks is another book. That book is by Thomas Mann, and that is another book that was actually inspired by the Forsyte Saga specifically. I haven't read that yet, but I do own it. It is on my TBR, so I'm definitely moving it up the list of books that I want to read soon. 100 Years of Solitude is another family saga that you might see some relations to that book and this book in terms of themes and the stories. There is also The Good Earth by Pearl Buck, which is also a multi-generational story. There is The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton that takes place basically in the same time period but in the US. And while I'm not sure that that is a family saga, definitely has shared themes and topics with this book. And another book that I felt like shared some similar themes and topics with the Forsyte Saga in terms of a critique on society and the same level of society to some extent would be The Great Gatsby, which is also a book that I read recently that when I started The Man of Property, I went, wow, I really feel like I've read something similar to this. And it occurred to me, oh yeah, The Great Gatsby, of course, similar time period or same time period, basically. So that is it. Those are all my recommendations for continued reading. Those are my thoughts on the Forsyte Saga. And I guess the question remains, am I going to continue with this series? So if I haven't said that already, no, I'm not. Sorry. I know this is a much loved series by a lot of people, but I'm really realizing that while I could probably get over some of the family drama, which I don't always like in my stories, even though like I can have fun with it in the moment, I can't get over the fact that this really isn't a family that I feel personally invested in. And so for me, it's not worth reading another 8 books because I'm still going to be with that family and that's not going to change. So I'm going to continue my little journey in trying to read books from the Edwardian era, which this book does fall into. But I think the next book that I might try and pick up is the Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist. That's not a family story or a family saga, which is fine, but it does deal with a different class of people during the same time period. And so I think it might be a story that I feel more invested in. That's it for me for today. Let me know if you've read this book and if you enjoyed it, or if after listening to this book, you're going to decide to read it or maybe not. And yeah, that's it. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye.